Fewer than 10% of Americans are buying $1,000 smartphones, report says. Can't say this is much of a surprise, though it does seem like a low figure considering how many flagships come in at a retail price above $1,000 in 2019. Devices like the one pictured in this article on Ars Technica, which is, of course, a Galaxy Note 10 Plus, which is, of course, a device that I recently unboxed a special edition of, which was actually $1,300, so it was even more. But the iPhone falls into that territory when you're talking about the Pro versions. And there's plenty of others. We don't really have to go into it. The $1,000 plus smartphone camp. Now, we've talked in the past about how that area of the marketplace is slowing down a bit and people are looking more for value or they're upgrading less frequently. But it turns out an interesting discovery, or maybe it's not that much of a surprise to people, but it does act as an indicator to try to figure out how the marketplace is operating. You have most of the $1,000 plus smartphone interest centered in certain urban areas, places like New York and Los Angeles. I'm sure Toronto would be similar. So the sensitivity to the $1,000 plus smartphones is likely more distributed across wider regions, less urban populations. And so you do likely have a difference, well, like a lot of other products that people buy, where cost sensitivity, price sensitivity maps accordingly to people's incomes and to various other factors. Now, this is, of course, important information for device manufacturers because when they're sitting there thinking, okay, our new device is coming out, flagship level, it's going to be $1,000. Where do we market it? Where do those billboards go? Who do we want to be talking to? How do we find the individuals that might be interested? Now, the problem that comes in is when you start talking about next generation devices and connectivity. We're talking about 5G coming up very shortly, and presumably those devices will first be available at the flagship tier. So at that $1,000 plus price point. So likely you're going to have people getting access to new technologies in certain regions long before other people are capable of experiencing those technologies. And what would be the incentive to go and build out those technologies in regions where people aren't even going to have the devices to access them for a very long period of time? So you could have some fairly large landscapes where people are lacking the same degree of connectivity as other people who choose to be in or can work in certain environments. This fatigue that's happening at the top end that we've been talking about for a while, it's indicative of a couple things, right? It's not just the fact that people are finding value in other smartphones. It could also be a sort of more macro situation of people not having the money to begin with like they used to. But the takeaway is that once upon a time, not that long ago, the flagship device was the device, whether it was an iPhone or a Samsung. There was far less selection in the first place. So even though it wasn't $1,000, the options just weren't even there to even have an opinion on the matter. To even say to yourself, no, I'm not looking to afford a $1,000 plus handset. And even if I was, I'm going to hold on to it for a while. So it's not a surprise to me, but it is just a little bit more detail into how people think about these purchases and who's actually willing to foot the bill for some of these very expensive devices. As we're going to talk about in the next story, there's even more expensive devices than $1,000. We have the devices, the folding devices, the $2,000 devices, the very aspirational devices. Now, the other thing I will say, as far as the geographic component is concerned, before we move on, I think there's a reason that those urban areas gravitate as well towards these devices because often, well, take a look at us. We're content creators, right? We post videos about this stuff. What happens is if you are talking about you're part of a media marketplace and you are talking about the top tier device, you're going to potentially get an audience for that content for people who can afford it, are interested in buying it, and also people who just want to see what the best thing is. Mm-hmm. It kind of reminds me of automotive coverage where a Ferrari is cool to anyone, almost like it has some kind of inherent cool factor, whether you're interested in buying it or not. Now, Ferrari's a weird fringe. That's probably too far.
Well, it's like a feat of engineering.
Exactly. There's kind of a need to know about the cutting edge, even if you eventually land on a mid-range kind of device eventually, versus if a channel like ours upstairs focused on mid-range stuff, which we do try to show a little bit of it. Well, first of all, the 10% that have the money to buy something else are not interested. And then on top of that, once you get into the mid-range, you're typically talking about slightly older hardware, right? Not the cutting edge hardware. So now you've taken out just the tech fan in general, potentially delivered something slightly less interesting because you're getting very practical at that point. So there's an overrepresentation at the top end from a publication perspective, but an underrepresentation of people that will actually experience that top end, own it themselves, but will be willing to watch it. So sometimes we're a bit skewed in how we view the actual landscape. Imagine, Will, we just did a video on the Note 10 Plus. Feels like everybody's interested in the Note 10 Plus or the iPhone 11 Pro Max. Turns out 10%. 10% of people will actually have it. So I think it's important to keep that in the frame of mind when you're discussing these types of things, these price points. Just recognize what the real decision makers are up against, and the fact that when something exciting does happen inside of the mid range, how many more people that potentially applies to.
Right.
That's sort of my takeaway from this. But 5G's on the way, and that's going to be a big differentiator.